Chapter 20, Part 2, The Progressive Era, 1890 to 1920. There are three presidents that are considered progressive presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Teddy Roosevelt is the first of these progressive presidents, and he's also considered the first modern president because he brought many new ideas and new precedents to the presidency. One of the things that we see that set Roosevelt apart from his predecessors is that he believes in legislative leadership. He believes that it is the role of the president to also bring legislation before Congress, to have a congressional agenda, if you would, and then use his leadership's abilities to convince Congress to pass that legislative package. And we'll see, obviously, that this becomes something that is very widely expected of presidents today in the 20th and 21st centuries. He also believes in very strong executive leadership. He believes that the role of the president is to be the leader of the country and not to sit back and let others take the reins, but it is the role of the president to exemplify leadership. And so he does that to a degree that we have not seen in most of his predecessors. Also, we see that Teddy Roosevelt, for the first time of any politician, really uses the media. He uses the newspapers and the early forms of photography that are coming about, and the early forms of film that are coming out in the early 20th century to put himself out there before the public. So he's always out there. People see him, they know him, they are very much aware that he is the president of the country and he's not just some remote figure in Washington, D.C. When Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901 upon the unfortunate assassination of William McKinley, one of the first things he did was take on one of the largest corporations in the country, and that was the Northern Securities Company. The Northern Security Company was this huge railroad conglomerate that controlled most of the railroads in the country, and Roosevelt felt that the Northern Securities Company was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So he ordered his Attorney General to bring a lawsuit against the Northern Securities Company for violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The lawsuit was filed in 1902, and it took about 2 years for it to make its way through the court system and eventually moved all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court handed down its decision in 1904, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Northern Securities Company was a combination which restrained trade, therefore it was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and so the Northern Securities Company must be broken up. And this is the first time we see the federal government really stepping in to use the Sherman Antitrust Act against one of these large corporations. And it's very interesting because the Northern Securities Company was actually owned by J.P. Morgan, who was the wealthiest man in the country at the time. So after the success of the Northern Securities Company case, we see other cases being brought against other trusts, other large conglomerates that can control whole industries like the meatpacking industry or the tobacco industry. And Teddy Roosevelt earned the nickname that he was a trust buster, and that will be used to his advantage during the election of 1904. Another thing that we see Roosevelt doing as he's finishing McKinley's term is he will take on the coal mining companies. In 1901, the coal mining companies had gone on strike against, the coal miners had gone on strike against the coal mining companies for better pay, better working conditions. And in the beginning, everyone is very much for the labor union, the United Mine Workers Union. But as the strike goes into the fall months, everyone really starts to get worried that Many of the cities are going to begin running out of heating fuel as we move into the winter, because coal not only was the major source of fuel for factories, but it was also used for heating fuel in many homes. So Roosevelt stepped in and offered to arbitrate between the labor union and the mine owners. Well, the mine owners turned him down. They said, no, we don't want your arbitration, because they figured that they could do what they've always done, and that is wait out the workers, and the workers will have to come back to work on the company's terms. But Roosevelt felt very strongly that the workers had legitimate complaints, and so basically he threatened the mine owners. He told them that they could either come to the table and arbitrate with the union, or he would bring in the army and nationalize the coal mines in the interest of national security. And so at that point, the mine owner said, well, yes, we'll sit down at the table and talk about things. So the result of Roosevelt's arbitration of this strike is a success, really, for the workers for the first time. The coal miners earned a 9-hour workday, which was, moving them closer to that 8-hour workday. They also got a 10% wage increase. That's a huge increase that you don't normally get all at one time. And they also earned the right to a permanent board of conciliation, which this would mean basically is collective bargaining. This board would be a place where workers could go to take their concerns, their complaints, without the fear of them getting fired. And so Roosevelt has stepped in early in his presidency to bust up one of the major corporations in the country, and also to take on another major industry, coal mining, in the interest of labor. Upon the success of his early endeavors finishing out McKinley's term those last 3 years, Roosevelt decides that he will run for the presidency in his own right in 1904. He is overwhelmingly elected, and when he is elected, he begins his domestic policy, which is often referred to as the Square Deal. And there are actually 3 major focuses that Roosevelt will have in the Square Deal: regulation of railroads, protecting the consumer, and conservation of natural resources. On the first one, regulation of railroads, this was, of course, very important. It was something the populace had been complaining about since the 1880s, how the railroads were abusing the people. And so Roosevelt, during his first full term as president, will be able to get the Hepburn Act passed to regulate railroads. The Hepburn Act is the first really effective regulation of the railroads. It will expand the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Interstate Commerce Commission, under the Hepburn Act, will be allowed to set maximum rates for railroad shipping. So they can tell the railroads how much is a maximum that they can charge to ship certain goods from certain areas. The railroads can complain that this is too low of a rate, and they can go to the courts to try to get the rate increased. But they only have 30 days to comply, and so if they take it to court, they have to go ahead and comply with the rate set by the ICC within that 30-day period, and then wait on the courts to change it. This is very important, because what the railroads had done before was, when the ICC would try to set rates for the railroads would tie up the new rates in court for years and years and years, and the rates never got changed. So now the railroads do have to comply within 30 days, and so they don't see any advantage, really, of tying it up in court for long periods of time. Also, under the Hepburn Act, the Interstate Commerce Commission powers will be expanded to also include storage facilities and terminal facilities to try to help keep those areas from the abuses that they were doing at the same time. For the second part of this square deal, Roosevelt wants to protect the consumer. This is really an offshoot of the book The Jungle that we talked about in the first part of chapter 20. People became very concerned about the safety of their food after The Jungle was written. So Roosevelt had Congress appoint a special committee to investigate the food industry. And of course, what most people expected was that Upton Sinclair had probably exaggerated a lot of the things in the book. But what they found out was actually he had not exaggerated, that the situation in the meat packing industry and the food industries was much worse than what was written in the book. There were so many health violations going on at the time. Unsanitary conditions, the plants were never cleaned, there were rats running around the food, and flies, and spoiled meat was getting chopped up and put into sausage, and just all kinds of horrible things. And of course, since it is a congressional investigation, the findings are made public, and so it led to some legislation to stop those unhealthy practices. The first part of this is the Meat Inspection Act. The Meat Inspection Act provided that any meat shipped over state lines would be subject to federal inspection from the corral to the can. So most meat, of course, is shipped over state lines because it comes up to the eastern cities from Texas and Kansas and the western states. And so this pretty much means all the meat that would be sold in the country would be subject to this act. From the corral to the can means from the time the animals are sold in preparation for being made into meat. So before they're even slaughtered, they can check the animals to make sure that they're healthy, that they're not carrying any diseases, all the way up until, you know, they're placed into the can, because at this time most of the meat was canned. They can, at any point along that way, it can be inspected. So this will take care of some of the fears that people have about the food being unclean and unsafe. In conjunction with the Meat Inspection Act, we're also going to get the Food and Drug Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act came about because really we didn't know a lot of things that were in these cans of food or in our medicines. With the cans, you know, a lot of times things could be mislabeled and you would not know, especially if it's potted meat or something. You don't really know exactly what's in there. For drugs, at this time, a lot of the medicines were actually alcohol-based, and so you had cough medicine that was almost pure alcohol. Some of the medicines also had very, very high percentages of opioids, and so it was very important that we have a body to look after us to make sure that what our pharmacies and what our grocers are telling us are in these products is actually what is in there. So under the Pure Food and Drug Act, this is where they say that you have to actually have the contents of a product written on the can, or as it would be, or the bottle. And so today, if you go into the store, or even if you just buy a candy bar, all the contents, everything that is in that item that you're eating, you can see it. And so we know what's in there. The third part of Teddy Roosevelt's square deal was conservation of natural resources. Roosevelt was a big outdoorsman. He was a big hunter. He felt that it was very important for us to conserve our natural resources in our country, because if we didn't, they were just going to be completely gone away. And so he was very concerned about the lumber companies that were cutting down huge chunks of our forest lands and the mining companies that were blowing up whole sides of mountains in order to get to gold and other precious metals. So he became an advocate for conservation. And this is really important because there had been a conservation movement before Roosevelt became president, but it was kind of on the fringe of society, and people thought, you know, they were kind of radicals, you know, that term we might use today, tree huggers, kind of off the wall. But Roosevelt said, no, this is something we should all be concerned with. We all need to conserve our resources and make sure that we have forest lands and clean water. And so he kind of brought conservation into the mainstream in America. And his acts at conservation will be built on by later presidents, all the way up to, you know, we get to Richard Nixon in the 1970s, who is responsible for creating the Environmental Protection Agency. So it wasn't something that was popular for a little while and went away. It's something that's still around even today. One of the acts that Roosevelt was able to get passed was the Forest Reserve Act. And this is exactly what it sounds like. By the time Roosevelt became president, most of our virgin forest lands had been destroyed in our country. We only had about 200,000 acres of virgin forest land still left in this wild country of ours. And so the Forest Reserve Act will take 150 excuse me, I should have said 200 million acres of forest land. It will take 150 million of those acres and put them into reserves. What that means is that 150 million acres of land cannot be used by lumber companies. They can't come in and clear cut the land. It can't be used by mining companies or any other companies. That the land is set aside to preserve it, to make sure that we have these forest lands. And what we see coming out of these Forest Reserve Act is the creation of wildlife sanctuaries, many of our national parks, you know, so that we can make sure that we will always have these lands available to Americans, because we need clean air, and in order to have clean air, you need trees. So that was a major act that he passed. A second act that was passed dealing with conservation was the Newlands Reclamation Act. The Newlands Reclamation Act was designed to try to get more water projects in the western states. One of the hardships that people in the western states had, of course, was adequate water for their farming and for just personal use. So the Newlands Reclamation Act provided that the money from the sale of public lands in 16 of the western states would be used to build water projects, water irrigation projects in those states. And so we see from that many of the water projects that were built coming about to help irrigate those lands, make those lands more usable in like California and Nevada, Arizona. Probably one of the most famous of the irrigation projects that was built under the Newlands Reclamation Act was the Roosevelt Dam, which made huge areas of land now usable for farming and for human habitation. So conservation of natural resources was something that was very special to Roosevelt, and he felt that it was his greatest legacy when he left the presidency in 1908. In 1908, Roosevelt decided not to run for re-election. He could have. He had only been elected to one full term, and he had served a total of 7 years as president. But he decided he wanted to step aside, spend more time with his children, because he was the youngest president, and he did still have young children at home. And he wanted to go hunting and do all of the things that he really enjoyed doing. So he decided not to run for re-election, but he endorsed a member of his cabinet, William Howard Taft, to replace him as the Republican candidate. And really, because of Roosevelt's endorsement, Taft will win the election in 1908. William Howard Taft will only be the president for one term. But during the time that he is president, there will still be much progressive legislation that is passed. Taft is more conservative than Roosevelt, and actually some historians have actually stated that Taft was not really progressive, and that progressive legislation was actually passed in spite of Taft. But there was progressive legislation that was passed during his presidency, so he is included as one of the progressive presidents, mainly because I guess Congress was still very progressive at the time. Excuse me. One of the things that we see, is Taft's administration will be responsible for continuing to push for regulation of big businesses. And one of the first acts that regulated big business during the Taft administration was the Mann-Elkins Act, which was really an extension of the Hepburn Act. The Mann-Elkins Act will add some new industries under the control of the Interstate Commerce Commission. It will add telephone and telegraph lines also under the control of the Interstate Commerce Commission, so not just railroads and those businesses directly related to railroads like terminals and storage facilities, but also now telephone and telegraph lines. Another thing that we see that extends the power of the federal government over big business is the Physical Evaluation Act. The Physical Evaluation Act will allow the Interstate Commerce Commission to physically go onto the property of businesses involved in interstate commerce, and based on the physical evaluation of that company, physically looking at their books, looking at their processes and procedures for creating their projects, then the Interstate Commerce Commission can establish maximum rates that those businesses can charge. So the Mann-Elkins Act and the Physical Evaluation Act are an extension of the federal government's powers over big business. A couple of other acts that we see that gain power or passed during this time are two new amendments. Amendments, of course, have to be ratified by the states, but they usually begin in Congress. And so the 16th and 17th Amendments are actually finalized during the Wilson administration, but they they're passed by Congress during the Taft administration, and many states began to pass them during the Taft administration. So I usually include them with accomplishments of the Taft administration. The 16th Amendment made the federal income tax constitutional. Now, some people may look at the income tax as not necessarily being a reform or a progressive reform, but if we go back and we think about before we had the income tax, remember, property taxes were the primary method of raising money by the states and by the federal government. And so the income tax is a way to actually make those big business people like the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and those individuals actually pay a larger percentage to the government. Because when we were talking about property taxes, we're actually talking about physical property, land. We're not talking about stocks and bonds and those types of things that we talk about today. So the 16th Amendment made the federal income tax constitutional. It said that Congress could pass an income tax at some point in the future. It doesn't establish a tax, but it says it can establish a tax, if that makes some sense. It will in a minute when we talk about Woodrow Wilson. The 17th Amendment provided for the direct election of U.S. senators. And if we go back, this was actually one of the ideas of the populists, is that We should elect the senators the same way that Congress, the members of the House of Representatives are elected, directly by the people, instead of them being selected by their state. This would make them more accountable to their constituencies at home. So these are two new amendments to the Constitution that will eventually be added as a result of them being started during the Taft administration. But in two other areas that was very dear to progressives, Taft is going to disappoint progressives, and one was the tariff. The progressives had from the beginning pushed for a reduction in the tariff. Now remember, tariffs are import taxes. It's what we pay, what we charge foreign countries to do business in America, for them to bring their foreign products into America. And the progressives, as well as the populists, had always felt that the tariffs were getting too high, and the tariffs were hurting farmer groups who, when we have high import taxes in our country, then other countries reciprocate. So they said these high taxes are hurting our farmers because it's limiting how much they can sell overseas. It also makes foreign goods more expensive, and so it forces Americans oftentimes to either not be able to buy those goods at all, and then they have to buy American goods, or pay a much higher price for those goods. So big business liked the high tariffs because it forced Americans to buy their products. So it's really a fight between rural interests and business interests when you get to the fight over how high the tariffs should be. So during Taft's candidacy, he had said that he would fight for progressive reform on the tariff. And so the progressives felt that that meant he was saying he was going to work for a lower tariff. During his presidency, though, the Payne-Aldrich tariff was passed. The Payne-Aldrich tariff actually increased the tariff on many items. It was one of those kind of weird tariffs that it did reduce the tariffs in some areas, but it increased the tariff in other areas. So if you did a balance sheet on it, it probably increased the tariff more than it reduced the tariff. So it was passed by Congress, and Taft signed it. He did not veto it. But not only did he sign it, he also said that it was the best tariff that the Republican Party had ever passed. So it kind of put the progressives on notice that Taft is not really a supporter of reducing the tariff, that he's going to side with big business and try to keep the tariff high. Another area that caused Taft to lose support among traditional progressives was in conservation. There was an incident dealing with his chief forester, who was Gifford Pinchot, and the Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, which now is referred to as the Pinchot-Ballinger affair, that brought to light that the Secretary of the Interior, Ballinger, was allowing some businesses to use the reserve lands in Alaska. And when Gifford Pinchot found out about this, he was very disturbed, and he took his information to the president. Ballinger denied the accusations, even though there was a lot of evidence to support the allegations. And Taft decided that he would side with Ballinger against Pinchot. And so Pinchot then took his information to the newspapers. And so, of course, a big scandal erupted because these reserve lands, as we were saying earlier, were supposed to be reserved. They weren't supposed to be used by big business. Taft decided that he would fire Gifford Pinchot. And so he fired Pinchot, and this even made, the situation get even worse. To add fuel to the flames, Gifford Pinchot was a very good friend of Teddy Roosevelt, and he had helped Roosevelt formulate much of the early conservation legislation that Roosevelt had gotten pushed through. So Roosevelt at this point decides to break with Taft. He basically says Taft is disappointing him. He's not following through with his programs. So Roosevelt decides that he will oppose Taft in the 1912 election in trying to gain the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1912. So in 1912, since Roosevelt has decided to oppose Taft for the election, there is going to actually be a split in the Republican Party. The hardline traditional Republicans actually liked Taft because he was easier to control than Roosevelt. He wasn't as progressive, or today's term, liberal, as Roosevelt. And so they said they were going to nominate Taft anyway. So Roosevelt said, that's fine, you nominate Taft. I will just create my own political party. So Roosevelt created the Progressive Party, which is also sometimes referred to as the Bull Moose Party, because, you know, as we look at the parties, the Democrats have the donkey, the Republicans have the elephant, and Roosevelt used the big bull moose with the big antlers as the symbol for his party. So Roosevelt will create his own party. He has a very aggressive, progressive agenda or platform for his party. He called for support for women's suffrage, effective regulation of big business, a federal trade and tariff commission to regulate that business. He called for a minimum wage for women. So a very progressive agenda that he has for his party. As I stated earlier, Taft will run as the Republican candidate, and the Democrats will nominate Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was also considered a progressive. He was a Democratic progressive. He had been serving as the governor of New York. He had also previously been the president of Princeton University. And so they felt that, the Democrats feel that they have, for the first time in a long time, really since Grover Cleveland in the 1880s, have the opportunity to win the presidency. And we will see, when we look at the next slide, that they will win that presidency mainly because of the split in the Republican Party. This election map of 1912 shows us that Woodrow Wilson won a huge majority of the Electoral College votes. That light blue color, he carried all those electoral votes in all of those states. Teddy Roosevelt won the second highest number of Electoral College votes, but also the second highest number of popular votes. He carried those green states. And Taft, who is in that kind of coral orangey color, won the least number of Electoral College votes. But he actually came pretty close to Roosevelt in that popular vote. If you added Roosevelt and Taft's popular votes together, then, you know, they would have won more popular vote than Woodrow Wilson, and that may have changed the Electoral College map. But Woodrow Wilson won the presidency, and he won it with an overwhelming Electoral College vote. Wilson took over the presidency in 1913 after the 1912 election. He took on the tariff issue. He called a special session of Congress to look at this issue specifically, and the result of that will be the Underwood-Simmons Act. The Underwood-Simmons Act established the first real reduction in the tariff since the Civil War. Now, to make up for that loss of revenue, the Underwood-Simmons Act will also create the first federal income tax. Remember, the 16th Amendment said we could have an income tax. It was constitutional, but it does not enact an income tax. So the Underwood-Simmons Act is the first federal income tax act. The Underwood-Simmons income tax created a graduated income tax that would have rates from 1% to 6%. 1% being the lowest income tax rate you would pay, 6% being the very highest. The most wealthy individuals would pay 6%. There was a poverty threshold. We have something today along this line. If you made $3,000 or less a year, you would be exempt from the income tax under the Underwood-Simmons Act. So this graduated income tax becomes the baseline for what we have today. Of course, our tax rates are much higher than 1 to 6%, but this is the pattern that we will use from this point forward. Another thing that Wilson will take on is the banking system. The banking system had really been in pretty much a mess since Andrew Jackson had dissolved the Bank of the United States during his presidency in the 1830s. We had had no real method for the federal government to regulate banking or to regulate the economy. So Wilson will push through the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve Act created 12 regional banking districts. And in each one of those banking districts, there would be a Federal Reserve Bank. I've given you a little diagram here to kind of show you how it would work in each district. So each regional banking district would have a Federal Reserve Bank. Members of the Federal Reserve would have to put 6% of their capital into the Federal Reserve Bank in their district. Now you may ask, how would you become a member bank in the Federal Reserve? If you were a federal bank, you had to become part of the Federal Reserve. You didn't have a choice. Other banks, state banks, private banks, they could join if they wanted to, but they don't have to. So they will put 6% of their capital into the Federal Reserve Bank in their district. Based on this capital, this money, the Federal Reserve then would create a new type of money called Federal Reserve Notes. And then the Federal Reserve Notes would be the money that would be circulated by the Federal Reserve System. So you see the member bank capital going in from our diagram and the Federal Reserve Notes coming out. This Federal Reserve Notes have become the primary money that we have in the United States today. If you have paper money, in your wallet or your purse right now, a dollar bill, it will say on the top of it, Federal Reserve Note, because the Federal Reserve has taken over our money system. Every now and then you'll see a Treasury note, but we don't really create Treasury notes anymore. We mostly deal with Federal Reserve notes. So this is the new type of money. So if you do business with a Federal Reserve Bank, you will put your money in, you will get Federal Reserve monies out. If you take a loan from the Federal Reserve Bank, you will get Federal Reserve notes. And so it's really taken over our money system. That's the type of money that we have. In order to keep everything on the up and up, there is a Federal Reserve Board that oversees all banks in the Federal Reserve. That Federal Reserve Board is appointed by the President. The chairman of the Federal Reserve has a great deal of power as far as raising interest rates or lowering interest rates, and he does that to regulate how much money is in the economy. So if we raise interest rates, we're afraid that there's too much money in the economy and we're going into a period of inflation, so they raise interest rates to reduce the amount of money in circulation. If we don't think there is enough money in circulation, we want people to buy more things, then we lower the interest rate. That makes it easier to go out and buy a car or buy a house by lowering those interest rates. The Federal Reserve Board also makes sure that all of those banks have sound practices, that they have the proper collateral when they're taking loans and those types of things. And so the Federal Reserve System that was set up in 1913 is the basis of the Federal Reserve System that we have today. It's made some minor changes, of course, as we've become a larger country and more industrialized and more people, But this is the foundation of the system that we have today. There are more than 12 Federal Reserve banks, but this is pretty much the system that we have in place today. By 1923, the Federal Reserve System was so popular that 70% of the banks in the country had joined the Federal Reserve System, and many of those banks didn't have to. They were state banks or private banks, but they saw that people trusted the Federal Reserve banks more because of this oversight of these banks, and so more and more banks began to join the Federal Reserve System. During Wilson's 8 years in the presidency, because he will serve 2 terms, he will also push through legislation to continue regulating big business and to try to help individuals more. And one of the acts that were passed to help regulate big business during his administration was the Federal Trade Commission Act. The Federal Trade Commission Act created the Federal Trade Commission, which today we refer to as the FTC. The Federal Trade Commission is an appointed commission that can look into any business involved in interstate commerce. So it goes a little bit further than the ICC, where we were starting to say, well, the ICC can look at telephones, telegraphs, railroads, et cetera, et cetera. The FTC can look at any business involved in interstate commerce, which is most businesses, because no matter what, if you sell your goods across state lines, that makes it interstate commerce. So they can look into those businesses, and if they see that one of these businesses is violating the Sherman Antitrust Act or other legislation, they can order that business to stop whatever it is that it's doing. The Federal Trade Commission Act outlawed what they termed unfair trade practices. The problem with this statement is, though, they outlawed unfair trade practices, but they did not define what those unfair trade practices were. So if a business was told that you need to stop this unfair trade practice, it was easy to go to court and say, well, they didn't define that, so we didn't know what we were doing was, quote, unfair. So a few months after the Federal Trade Commission Act was passed, to go along with the Federal Trade Commission Act, Congress will pass the Clayton Act. The Clayton Act will actually define unfair trade practices, and some of the things that were defined as unfair trade practices under the Clayton Act was something called price discrimination. This is when you charge one person or one company a different price than you charge this other company. So say your friend has a shoe company and he wants to ship shoes on your railroad, you would charge him less. They said that's unfair. You can't do that. You have to charge the same rates regardless of who the individuals are or the businesses are. They also, under the Clayton Act, defined buying competition in your buying stock in your competition as an unfair trade practice, because this was another method that some of these companies, especially railroad companies, were using to control an industry. They would buy up a bunch of stock in their competition, and so technically the other company still existed separately, but one guy or another business controls most of the stock, which means they really aren't operating independently. Another unfair trade practice that was established by the Clayton Act was something called interlocking directorates. This is when you have the same board of directors controlling several businesses in the same industry. So it would be like today if we had the same board of directors controlling GM, Chevy, and Dodge. So do you think there would be much competition among those big three automakers? Probably not. They'd probably start dividing up the market. So the Clayton Act is a companion act really for the Federal Trade Commission Act. It defines those unfair trade practices. The other thing we see with the Clayton Act is it also helped the labor unions. The Clayton Act said that labor unions could not be defined as conspiracies that restrain trade, which was a way that some of the strikes had been broken. They said that when workers went on strike, they were restraining trade. Well, the Clayton Act says no. A strike is not a conspiracy that restrains trade. You can't, they're striking for different reasons. A couple of other acts that were passed that were considered progressive legislation during the Wilson administration. One was the Lafayette Act. The Lafayette Act raised the safety requirements on merchant ships in America. These are the ships that carry our goods to other countries. This isn't the Navy. And so to make sure that the workers on those merchant ships, those sailors on those merchant ships, were safer, the Lafayette Act was passed. Another act that was passed was the Adamson Act. The Adamson Act provided an 8-hour workday for workers on interstate railroads. It did specifically say for railroad workers, but once the railroad workers got that 8-hour workday, that's, you know, the beginning of other industries are going to start getting that 8-hour workday. The Keating-Owens Act tried to end child labor. The Keating-Owens Act was passed in 1916, and it said products made using child labor could not be sold in interstate commerce. So it was, the Keating-Owens Act was careful in their language. They didn't say you can't have child labor, but they said if you choose to use child labor, those products made using that child labor can't be sold in interstate commerce, which is under the control of the federal government. The Keating-Owens Act was only in place for about 2 years, and in 1918, the Supreme Court ruled the Keating-Owens Act was actually unconstitutional. So even though the progressives did try to work to end child labor, legislation outlawing child labor was not upheld by the courts. As we were talking earlier, what really helps end child labor in our country is mandatory school attendance laws that are created by the states. And then if you have to go to school, they can't be working in the factories. And that's what eventually begins to help us with the child labor issues. Another progressive measure that was passed during the Wilson administration was the Smith-Hughes Act. The Smith-Hughes Act provided federal funding for vocational and agricultural education. So this is actually a companion act to that Morial Land Act that we talked about way back in chapter 15. Those A&M colleges were created with the Morial Land Act, and then the Smith-Hughes Act is going to give them more money to implement actual vocational and agricultural programs at those A&M colleges. But the Smith-Hughes Act also gave some of that federal money to secondary schools, to high schools. So we begin to see in our school reform, we begin to see ag classes being taught. We begin to see our carpentry classes and some of those other vocational, or what today we would call career and technical classes being taught in those schools. Of course, one of the major accomplishments that we often identify with the progressive movement is women's suffrage, the right of women to vote. Women have been pushing for the right to vote really since before the Civil War. And then we see, of course, after the Civil War, individuals like Susan B. Anthony had really worked very hard to try to get women's rights integrated into the 14th and 15th Amendments, but they had not been successful in doing that. By the time we get to the early 20th century, of course, Susan B. Anthony has passed away, and other of those leading suffragists of the 19th century have passed away. But the movement continues, and we have a new group of women that will be pushing for women's suffrage. Carrie Chapman Catt, Harriet Bloch, Alice Paul, probably one of the biggest ones, Alice Paul in the 20th century. And they began organizing huge parades in all the big cities, demanding, women's suffrage and advocating for women's suffrage, huge meetings and protests. They marched in front of the White House, protesting during World War I, really pushing, the president to push forward legislation to try to get women to vote. Women that participated in the suffrage movement often were horribly mistreated. They were beaten. They were placed in jail. At one point, Alice Paul, one of the times she was put in jail, she went on a hunger strike, and she was force-fed with a feeding tube, which was very painful, of course, at the time. So women really were greatly mistreated in these endeavors. It was suffrage in order to get suffrage. The National Women's Suffrage Association became the leading women's rights group at the time. It gained up to 2 million members. Finally, through the hard work of the suffragists and because of the role that women played during World War I, working in the factories, and we're going to talk about that when we get to chapter 21, when we talk about World War I. Finally, in 1920, soon after World War I, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and the 19th Amendment finally gave women the right to vote in the United States. This map just shows us the women's suffrage movement from 1869 to 1914, and it shows which states had adopted women's suffrage before the 19th Amendment and which states women did not gain the right to vote until the 19th Amendment. So you can kind of look at that and see which states fall where. In addition to the right to vote, some of the other things that women were fighting for were really more of more civil rights for American women. And so Emma Goldman is considered to be the leader of this new feminist movement. And one of the big things that the early feminists were concerned about were women's right to control their own bodies. And one of the things that they advocated for was the women's right for birth control. Margaret Sanger was a public health nurse, and she worked in a lot of these inner city neighborhoods, and she saw that the struggle that women went through by having, 4, 5, 6, 8, even 10 children, and it just took a toll on their health. And she really began advocating for birth control. And this is not abortion. She's talking about birth control, which was illegal at the time. There was no birth control pill or other methods of preventing women from becoming pregnant. Even though it was illegal in most states to provide birth control to women, Margaret Sanger began to provide birth control to women in some of these inner city neighborhoods. And for that reason, she was considered a criminal, and she actually had to flee the United States and go to Europe for a period of time to escape prosecution for providing birth control. The National Birth Control League was actually created in 1915. It's very interesting to note, as way up until the 1960s, birth control was illegal still in many states in the United States, and it was not until the 1960s that we finally get more widespread birth control being allowed in this country. As an offshoot of the progressive reform movement, we see many moral crusades coming about, and of course, unfortunately, sometimes with the moral crusades, you also get a measure of social control. There also begins to be a push in our country for more control of immigration, and in 1907, the Japanese Immigration Act was passed. This was very similar to the Chinese Immigration Act that had been passed back in the 1880s. The Japanese Immigration Act restricted the Japanese from coming to the United States also for a period of 10 years. Another big movement that gained a lot of measure during this time period was the temperance movement. The Anti-Saloon League had been around really since around the Civil War. The temperance movement had been around really since before the Civil War, but it gains a lot more momentum during the progressive movement, so much so that by the time we get to 1919, many states have already passed prohibition in their states. So in certain states, you could not drink alcohol. In 1919, Congress will pass the 18th Amendment, and that 18th Amendment will be ratified by the states to go into effect in 1920. The 18th Amendment will outlaw the sale, distribution, and consumption of alcohol in the United States. And that period of prohibition will be in place, as I said, it goes into effect in 1920, and it will stay in place until 1933, when the 21st Amendment is ratified. Another moral crusade that people went on was suppressing prostitution. It used to not be illegal to be a prostitute. It's that old, what's the term, that it's the oldest profession. Even back in the Bible, the prostitution was there. But under this idea that we need to be a more moral country, it was decided that prostitution should be made illegal. The Mann-Elkins Act was passed, which made it illegal to bring women across state lines for immoral purposes, was the terminology that we used. Then we also began to see that many states began to pass laws to prohibit prostitution in their states, and that's when prostitution became illegal, and you began to have what we call the red light districts. So it was pushed over into those kind of ghetto areas, and it was illegal to be involved in the prostitution industry. We also see that gambling began to be considered a bad thing. And so we began to see that there were measures to outlaw gambling in most states in our country, most cities and states, but not just gambling. Some states made saloons illegal, they made dance halls illegal, even some states made movie theaters illegal because movie theaters were just now coming about and they were new and people didn't understand, you know, the movies and things, and so it was considered to be immoral to go to the movies. So these are some other things that we see also as offshoots of the progressive movement. It also leads us to these moral crusades. And this is just a chart of some of the major pieces of legislation that were passed during the progressive era. It can be a kind of a little study sheet for you as you're getting prepared for your major exam for this module. You might want to, you know, look at this slide to look at just kind of a snapshot of some of the major pieces of legislation that were passed. And this concludes our Chapter 20 lecture notes, and the next chapter that we will be looking at is Chapter 21.